Good day, everyone. Today, we are going to learn about developments in the Aztec civilization. To begin with, the Aztec lived in Mesoamerica, mostly modern Mexico, starting around 1325 AD after the decline of Maya. The name Aztec came from the phrase people from Aztlan. Meanwhile, Aslan, which means place of whiteness or place of herons, is the mythical place of origin of Aztecs, also called Mexica. In addition, the Aztecs left their island homeland in 1100 AD, led by their ruler Tenoch, under the guidance of their primary deity Huitzilopochtli. They were instructed by their war god that they need have to find a new home. The god would send them a sign when they reach their new homeland. By the time Aztecs arrived in their new homeland in the early 1300s, there were already 40 to 50 established city-states in the valley in Lake Texcoco. Aztecs were driven and ejected from the valley. They fled to marshes in a small island of Acatzitlan, and around 1325 AD, they saw the gods' sign for their ultimate home, an eagle with a snake in its beak perched on a cactus on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco. On 20th of July, 1325 AD, the Aztecs established the city of Tenochtitlan, which means the place of prickly pear, and was named after their chief Tenoch. Meanwhile, located at the site of what is now Mexico City, Mexico, Tenochtitlan was built on two islands in Lake Texcoco and is connected to the mainland by several causeways. Furthermore, the Aztecs was ruled over by a series of leaders. In few years, they became most powerful empire, conquering many tribes in Mesoamerica before the Europeans arrived. On the other hand, the Aztec Empire was made up of series of city-states known as Altepetl. Each Altepetl was ruled by a supreme leader known as Tlatoani and supreme judge and administrator. The Tlatoani of the capital city of Tenochtitlan served as the Yui Tlatoani, which means great speaker of the Aztec Empire. Not deterred by the unfavorable terrain, they invented the artificial island farms called chinampas to help feed the huge growing city. Through the construction of artificial islands, Tenochtitlan grew more to cover 5 square miles. Meanwhile, the Aztecs grew different crops in the chinampas like maize, beans, cacao, chilies, squashes, potatoes, tomatoes, and avocados. Perhaps the most valued food was the cacao beans used to make chocolate. Also, colorful flowers were grown in chinampas and used for religious festivals and ceremonies. Between each garden was a canal which enabled canoe transport. Fish, shrimps, algae, and birds populated the water and were additional sources of food for the Aztecs. In addition, farming families often lived on earthen platforms near the chinampas in houses made of cane, wood, and reeds. Meanwhile, when the Aztecs began a new settlement, there were two things that they did before any development. They built a shrine to the god with Zilupochtli and a ball court. Around 1325, in the heart of the city, they built a temple pyramid that was quite small and was constructed out of earth and wood. It went through many different additions throughout the history of Aztec. It was called Templo Mayor or Great Temple, topped by twin temples dedicated to the war god Huitzilopochtli and the rain god Tlaloc. The Aztecs believed their pyramids were the homes of their gods and places of worship. They were also used to perform rituals of sacrifice. Moreover, the Aztecs worshipped many gods. Meanwhile, they believed animals and human sacrifices would appease their many gods. They sacrificed animals including dogs, eagles, jaguars, and deers. They often performed self-sacrifice whereby they perforated their tongues, earlobes, genitals, legs, and arms with knives, skewers, and maguey thorns. However, the Aztecs' most gruesome and violent aspect of their culture was their practice of human sacrifice, known as tlamik-tilitzli, the extraction of the heart. They usually sacrificed prisoners of wars. However, they also used volunteers, criminals, and even their own children. Children were sacrificed to appease the rain god. The Aztecs believed the rain god needed tears of children in exchange for giving them rain. Consequently, the priest tortured children before killing them to make them cry and produce as many tears as possible. In addition, there have been walls of skulls, also known as Zompantli or Great Skull Rock, created near temples or ball courts to display the heads of sacrificed human victims. Furthermore, it was so important that the ball courts known as Tlactli was one of the first things to be built, and it was often near a temple or shrine. The sports was named Olamalichli from the word Oli, which means rubber, and the verb Olama, which means to play ball. The objective was to get a hard rubber ball through a stone hoop, and the ball wasn't supposed to touch the ground. The players had to keep the ball moving, using their elbows, knees, hips, and heads. This game was entertaining activity of the Aztec Empire, but also had some political and religious significance. Moving on, given the swampy nature, the Aztec built causeways and canals for transportation to and from the city in 1350 AD. Also, there were small bridges built into the causeways that allowed small boats and canoes to travel under them. While in the event of an attack, these bridges would be removed. Furthermore, the Aztecs started to build in 1418 the first aqueduct to carry fresh water from springs into the city. A second aqueduct was constructed when the first aqueduct became inadequate in 1499. With the extensive water system in Aztec cities, there was an inclusion of steam baths called temazcal, and these were used to clean, to purify their soul, and to cure certain diseases. Lastly, serve as a site for women to bear children. Meanwhile, They had a system to handle human waste in the island. Human wastes were collected in canoes. The excrement was applied as fertilizer to chinampas or sold in the market to be used for tanning animal hides. On the other hand, urine was collected in pottery vessels to be used for treating skin diseases and the like. Furthermore, Tenochtitlan became a trading center with many people from other places as Aztecs created some of the largest markets in the world. People traded things like gold, silver, cloaks, precious stones, as well as cotton, chili sauces, and insects. They used cocoa beans for currency. Meanwhile, Aztecs followed a strict social hierarchy in which individuals were identified as king, nobles, commoners, serf, and slaves. At the very top of the society was the king along with his family. The Aztecs called their ruler Huey Tlatoani. He was considered the ultimate ruler of the land. They felt that he was appointed by the gods and had the divine right to rule. The king received tributes, oversaw markets and temples, led the military, and resolved judicial disputes. Next, nobles, also known as pipiltin, consisted of government or military leaders, high-level priests, and lords. They were known to be the wealthiest class. Nobles show their wealth by wearing decorated capes, feathers, and gold. Nobles are involved in making laws in government. They were entitled to receive tributes from commoners in the form of goods, services, and labor. Meanwhile, as part of the noble class, priests conducted all religious rites and served individual gods, while other priests studied the skies and made predictions about the future. Along with some priests ran the schools known as Talmikak that trained boys of nobles and exceptionally gifted commoners' boys for government jobs and priesthood. Next, there was a special class of merchants called Pochteca, who were highest-ranking commoners and professional long-distance traveling merchants. They provided luxury and exotic items from faraway lands. Some also served as spies for the emperor, reporting what type of tribute a city could provide. They also communicated vital information across the empire and beyond its borders. Next, the commoners class, also known as Maiswaltin, consisting of farmers, artisans, merchants, and low-level priests. Meanwhile, most farmers were engaged in agriculture, taking care of the chinampas, and they resided in Kalpul or neighborhood ward which were led by a single nobleman together with a council of commoner elders. In addition, each Kalpul had a school for commoners' children known as Telpochkali that trained young men to be warriors. The Aztecs additionally had serf. Serf, also known as Meyeki, were free people who worked land that was owned by nobles. They did not live in the Kalpuli. The Meyeki work as tenant farmers, fishermen, or artisans. Furthermore, the lowest social class in Aztec society were the slaves, also known as Tlacotin. For Aztecs, slavery was not something that you could be born with. Rather, these are people who became slaves of their own choosing as a type of punishment for a crime or because they were taken captive. Some may choose to enter slavery as means of paying off a financial debt, while some slaves might be sacrificed in a religious ceremony. Most were simply workers on the lands of wealthy nobles or merchants. In addition, the slave owners were expected to treat the slaves well, including feeding and housing them. In return, slaves were expected to follow rules of conduct and obey all reasonable commands from their owners. Slaves who did not follow the rules or who tried to escape were punished by being forced to wear a wooden collar. The collar had a long wooden staff attached that made it difficult for the slave to flee. Moreover, the Aztecs didn't have a writing system as we know it. Instead, they used pictograms, little pictures that conveyed meaning to the reader. Like Maya, the Aztecs had a book called Codex, and the codices were made of paper, deerskin, or maguey cloth. Strips of these materials were cut and the ends were pasted onto thin pieces of wood as the cover. The strip was folded like a concertina or a map. Meanwhile, the Aztec number system was vigesimal or base 20. Numbers up to 20 were represented by dots. A flag represented 20, which could be repeated as often as needed. 100, for instance, was 5 flags. 400 was depicted by the symbol of a feather or fir tree. The next number was 1,000, which was shown as a bag of copal incense. With these symbols, the Aztecs counted all their tribute and trade. Furthermore, one of the most famous aspects of Aztec technology was their use of calendars. The Aztecs used 2 calendars. One calendar was used for tracking religious ceremonies and festivals. This calendar had 265 days and was called Tonalpoali, which means day count. It was written in a language called Nahuatl. The other calendar was used to track time and was called Sayupuali. It had 365 days divided up into 18 months of 20 days each. It describes the days and rituals related to seasons, and therefore might be called the agricultural year or the solar year. Lastly, through marriages and alliances with ruling families in the other city-states, Aztec began to grow politically and economically. It met its end in 1521 by conquest at the hands of a contingent of Spanish soldiers headed by Hernan Cortes and disgruntled neighbors. In addition, Cortes and his men killed Moctezuma II, the emperor, and thousands of Aztecs during a ritual dance ceremony. Cortes' army besieged Tenochtitlan for 93 days, and a combination of superior weaponry and a devastating smallpox outbreak enabled the Spanish to conquer the city easily. Finally, Cortes had destroyed the Aztec capital and founded a new settlement, Mexico City, in its shadow. We can discuss the whole Spanish conquest of Aztec some other time.